Well, thanks for joining us on a slow week.
Yeah, not much going on.
Have the applications to transfer to your Vancouver office picked up over the last week?
I mean, in all seriousness, we have a lot of folks at Slack, and I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of our customers as well, that have a lot of open questions about what this outcome will mean for us. And so, it is. We have a lot of employees in Canada, and we have actually offices now in 4 or 5 countries around the world. Yep. And so, we're going to see what makes sense for us, but we're having a lot of those conversations, and they are hard conversations, as people they're scared and they're concerned, and we want to support our employees in the best way we can.
Are you envious you don't have your own fake news catastrophe to deal with, or is the Slack social graph safe from?
We'd rather be supporting media organizations like yourselves, be able to use Slack the product, than have to worry about the distribution of the news, I think. Yeah.
So how big is Slack now? I think everyone thinks of it as an upstart tool. You still have a very nice spring to your step as a company, it seems, but pretty big now, right?
Well, I mean, it is big and always growing in a variety of dimensions. I mean, on the business side, we over the summer passed $100 million in ARR. We have over 4 million daily active users and many more weekly active users. And then on the company side, we're up to around 700 people now. Yep. I think when I joined, we were about 150, and that was just a year and a half ago. So it's been phenomenal growth, and
wow.
We're doing our best to keep up with that. And but as we add to the team, there's so much more that we can do, and it's allowing us to be able to really get to a point where we can do a lot of things at once, and that includes all the work that Noah and team are doing in New York.
Yeah. We'll talk about that in a bit. We'll talk about competitors too. I'm curious, who's using Slack though? Are you, my first Slack team was 3 people, and then about 100 people, and now I'm in a 700-person Slack team. So I've seen a bunch of different experiences, but I'm curious, who's still adopting Slack? Where are you finding your growth from?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is that the way that adoption happens for Slack, it's oftentimes very organic. It sounds like that resonates with your experience as well. And so what look like small teams are oftentimes really, teams within Fortune 100 companies. And so, we see adoption of Slack from the largest companies in the world. We've got customers like, EA and LinkedIn and IBM. But we also see adoption among, small businesses around the world. And we're not just in the U.S. We have significant adoption outside the United States. And so what we have to do, our challenge, is to build an experience that actually helps, that is in line with our mission, which is to make people's working lives simpler, more productive, and more pleasant, and do that in a way where it works for the smallest companies in the world, also to the largest.
And can you hold that up? I remember reading that there was a report that Uber, for example, was too big for Slack and had to move to a competitive system. Have you gotten better at that?
So I think there's some good examples, even recent examples, where IBM, we just had a big partnership announced with their Watson team, and part of that was that they've already moved from about 5,000 people using Slack at the beginning of the year to over 30,000 now. So that's about, I think, 4.5 times Uber's scale. I think when you look at how Slack works most effectively, it's when we enable larger companies to basically operate as if they were a bunch of smaller teams doing their best work together. So what we're working on in terms of the product side is how do we help that scale? I think there's many companies, 28 of the Fortune 100 are already paying for Slack. And the way that we're doing that is by enabling those larger companies to kind of be able to function as these fast-moving teams, and how Slack enables them to do their best work in that way.
And what do you hear about how they're using it? Has it changed the nature of their work or the way that they get things done?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's this study that we often refer back to, which is actually by McKinsey from 2012, which is they kind of were asked, where do knowledge workers spend their time? Like, people were saying, okay, not the engineers, but the writers, the salespeople, the marketing folks, where are they actually spending their time every day? And it turned out they were spending about 30% of their time in meetings, 30% of their time managing communication, like email, and about 20% of their time looking for answers to questions that they have, whether it's an expert or what is a 401k policy or something like that. And what we're seeing with Slack, I think, is that it is becoming the place where a lot of that work actually happens, that communication flow, being able to get answers to questions, and hopefully over time seeing ways where we give people back that time and actually make them more productive, because all of their different communication and all their different tools from the platform side are all kind of plugging in and data is flowing through Slack, and they're able to do that all in one place instead of having to switch between 50 different tools that they use every day.
So one of the, Slack obviously kind of the most obvious feature is the chat. It's a pretty simple way to communicate with your team. But one of the more interesting things when it launched, especially to geeks like myself, were all these integrations. Like, oh, you could hook it up to GitHub, and some of the stuff you set up and then never use, and some of it you actually do end up using over time. How is that working? Has Slack managed to become more than just a messaging system for companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very much in our DNA. So Slack is a great place for people to communicate with each other, as you've described. Conversation happens in channels. It allows people to be able to organize the work that they're doing within their team, which is a great starting point. And that alone, already provides huge benefits over email, where, you open up your email and basically the sender decides what you need to pay attention to, and you have to spend all day sort of hacking away at your email inbox. Instead, you open up Slack and you can see based on the channels if there's anything important that you need to pay attention to. So that's a good foundation, but really since the outset, we've had this vision to be a platform. And we are. And so what we allow for is that, many teams, many of our customers use tens, if not hundreds of different applications. And the reason for that is that it's never been cheaper to build software. It's never been, there's never been more demand for niche tools that allow, designers to do their best work, accounting teams to do their best work. Like, whatever it is you do in a company, you've never had more options than you've ever had before. We don't get all of our software from one monolithic company anymore. And instead, there are hundreds and thousands of companies out there that have built these solutions. The problem is none of that software talks to each other. And so that's the vision for what we're doing with our platform at Slack, which is that we have an open platform that allows any of those companies, from the largest enterprise software companies in the world. We've recently announced integrations and partnerships with Salesforce and with IBM and with Google, but also to the hundreds and thousands of developers, upstart developers, teams of 2 or 4 that think, I've got a better way to do expense reporting, like Abacus, for example. And they actually are building applications that are tightly integrated with Slack. And so for teams that use Slack, these new solutions are viable options as compared to the legacy software they've been using. And they can find them in the Slack app directory, and they work together seamlessly. They work in the flow of the conversation and all the other work that's happening within the company every day. And so that is, we're going to keep investing in that. And we've seen 150 apps in our Slack app directory when it launched last December, and we now have 750. And so the growth has just been phenomenal this year. We've invested in many of those companies via the Slack fund as well. And so we're going really long on platform because it's really intrinsic to what we're doing.
Are people using them?
Absolutely. So 90% of paid teams use apps. So, I mean, if you think about that, we have
measured by active usage or installs?
Yeah, actual usage. Yeah. And so what we're seeing is that, teams, they join Slack and they immediately start enabling the apps that they already use. So these are things like Google Drive and Dropbox.
I was going to ask, what's the top app?
Off the top of my head, a lot of the top apps really are the software tools that people, that are already well known and used broadly. So things like Google's applications, there are some of the calling services like Hangouts, Zoom, Blue Jeans, etc. So many of those are very popular. But what they start doing is they discover that 2 things. Number one, in the Slack app directory, there are applications they've never heard of. Things like Envoy is the application that you oftentimes use to check into offices here at a lot of the companies in the Bay Area.
Oh, where I always refuse the NDA?
Exactly. That's the one. They've seen real usage. They've seen real
growth.
They love me. Right, but they've seen Envoy has seen growth because they have been discovered through companies in the Slack app by being listed in the Slack app directory. So there are companies like Envoy that many of our customers may have never heard of, and they're actually discovering new enterprise software tools. So we're driving connections between paying customers and applications that can be valuable to them. And so they discover that. They also learn that there's a lot that they can do to use our platform to really tailor fit the way they use Slack to their own purposes by building their own integrations, their own bots that tie into in-house tools, dashboards, all sorts of different applications. And we have a bunch of good examples of that. So it really makes Slack more of an operating system for how you're getting work done across your company. And the platform is really critical to where we're headed.
And so that's not an insignificant amount of work to build something good into that. 4 million users now, sounds all right. But what do you, not a ton. What do you kind of project? How do you think of and how do you describe the market to potential partners?
For developers that are looking to build software for teams at work, like we are, 4 million daily active users is a really incredible audience. And you look at the alternative. If you decided you wanted to build, for example, a new project management tool and get it in front of customers, get people trying it and paying for it, you would have had to hire, maybe your third or fourth hire would have had to have been a VP of sales. You'd be a couple of developers, maybe you've got this really clear product vision, but you have no idea really how to get it in the hands of customers and to break through the barriers and how many cold emails you're going to have to send CIOs and so forth to get them to try it out. Instead, the Slack app directory actually reduces that friction and makes it easier for customers to try new software. So it's 4 million daily active users of people using Slack. Primarily for work purposes, is a really meaningful audience that solves a key point of friction that has, I think, held the workplace back from having a lot of great software solutions, and we want to be a part of addressing that.
You just say 4 million, but they're hipsters, so
right.
Yeah.
I think the other thing from the developer perspective,
they're like you,
right? The other thing from the developer perspective is that you can kind of write once, and this runs everywhere that Slack runs. So I was at a dinner last week in New York with a bunch of our customers and also our developers, and what they were saying was being able to basically be able to write their Slack kind of bot that they're creating. This is actually Abacus was at this dinner. They're like, yeah, it took a couple weeks, and then it ran on iOS and Android and desktop and web, and it was this pretty kind of simple thing that they could build for, and then they get this kind of massive reach, much bigger than what they already have today. I think that's a really compelling story for developers. It's not that much extra effort, and then you get a lot more access. So,
all right, Noah, let's talk about you, because you're pretty new still.
Yep.
You joined from Foursquare.
Yep.
What are you doing at Slack?
Yeah, so I joined about 9 months ago, which I think puts me past the median tenure already, which is kind of a scary and exciting thing for how Slack is growing. But yeah, in New York, we basically are building out a team that's focused on how do we basically make Slack the product smarter and the companies like Vox that use it more productive the more history they have on the platform. And what that can look like is either a small company that uses Slack for a long time or a bigger company, 700 people using it for a couple months, where we can start kind of learning what are your patterns, who are the experts in different topics, who do you interact with, what are the topics that you care about, and then how do we start enhancing Slack the product using that information.
So what do I look like in your AI backend?
That's a good question. So we're starting to build what we're internally calling kind of our work graph, which is basically looking at you, Dan, and seeing, so what are the people that you seem to care the most about or respond the quickest to or interact with the most? What are the channels maybe that you're most active in? And then also, what are the kind of topics that you seem to care the most about? And then once we have that, we can start thinking about, well,
and do I clock in too? Is this where it's going?
We're not looking at that, but what is amazing about Slack, which allows us to do this, is I think April was kind of talking about this earlier, is just the intensity of usage that we see. Yes, 4 million users versus 1 billion users for a consumer service might seem small, but they're using it all day at work. They're using it for over 2 hours a day, and that's like foregrounded. So you can imagine how many messages they're sending and reading, and that allows us then build this kind of layer of intelligence to really understand not just what does the organization look like, but from your vantage point, Dan, or from Kara's vantage point, you guys care about maybe somewhat different things, and how do we personalize the service based on that?
So what do you do?
So what do we do?
What do you make, yeah.
So we've launched a few things so far, kind of using the beginnings of the work graph. One of the things that we have been talking about earlier is this idea that we can start helping you figure out what are the channels that you should actually care about. So we've started sending people these suggestions once a week via Slackbot to help you either find new channels to join based on the ones you're most active in, but you haven't entered yet. Channels that you might want to leave because you actually don't pay attention to them, but they're kind of weighing on you heavily. And also, when you join a channel, what are similar channels? So you join maybe the Facebook channel. Here are other related channels in terms of Vox Media's coverage that you might care about. And we're seeing really high engagement for these kind of things, over 30% CTRs from sending these suggestions, because I think people are kind of craving being able to figure out what should I be paying attention to in Slack, especially as organizations get bigger. They might have hundreds or thousands of channels. Which are the ones that they should focus on? And then looking forward over the next year.
I was going to say, so I noticed this feature.
Yep.
I've certainly been part of that 30% click-through rate.
Yeah.
But I immediately dismiss it after that, and I don't think about it anymore. And I don't know if I spend any time in those channels or not. So
yeah.
It's cool. I would not call it super substantive, though. So
yeah, that's definitely.
What's your vision for something spooky that you can do for me with AI?
I don't know if it's spooky so much as extremely helpful for your day-to-day productivity, but
it's a better way of describing.
Yeah. So what we're really working on is like there's the pull and push side of things, right? So on the pull side is once we have all these platform integrations piping data into Slack, and once people are using it for 2 hours a day, there's this tremendous kind of collective intelligence that emerges from just how your organization uses Slack. And from day one, search was a big part of how do you make all this information actually accessible to people. What we're working on now on the pull side is how do we start actually making search ranking work really well, personalized to you and everyone else in the organization. So if you're on the platform team at Slack and you search for a roadmap, you get a completely different set of messages than if you're on the growth team, for example, even though those are the same query.
Is that hooked up now, or is that?
It's something that we're running experiments with already. So if you are in the 5%, then you may be starting to get this experience, but probably not yet. And then over time, we want to be able to rank more than just messages, right? So there's files that people are uploading. There's people themselves, right? Helping someone find who is the right person to talk to about my 401k plan, or what's the best caching strategy, or who works with Abacus. That's extremely helpful in the context of a communication product. It's very different than searching on Google. And then also channels, and then also all the third-party integrations themselves. How do we make all that data that they're piping into Slack actually more accessible and more organized? And then the push side, as companies scale, especially, and they get to hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people, keeping up with all that information flowing through Slack can actually get fairly overwhelming. So we're really working on tools that help people focus their attention on what's most important to read first, be able to catch up more quickly when they actually are behind on channels, and then eventually kind of get a pulse for what's happening across their organization. So what are the conversations they would have missed because they're not even in those channels in the first place?
One thing I've noticed about using Slack is that it has become, maybe by accident, the company directory. And the profile page is kind of woefully underrepresented. Is that something you think about at all, or is that just such a far down on the list of ideas that being a more robust corporate directory is not that interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think for our customers, what we want to do is give them the flexibility to be able to make use of that profile and in that directory in the way that makes the most sense for them. I mean, we launched Slack calls earlier this year, and so one of the anecdotes that I often hear is that in this day and age, most of us don't have all of our colleagues' phone numbers in our phone. And so, I was talking to a customer out in Washington, D.C. earlier this year who had been running late because of traffic, and he was able to call one of his colleagues using Slack calls because they don't work together super closely. They don't have each other's phone numbers, but they were able to do that. So I think around connectivity, I think that's really valuable. We have what are called custom profile fields, and the intent there, I think, is aligned with where we want to go with this, which is that we know that every company works differently. So what we want to do is offer them really the surface area to customize Slack and tailor fit it to the way that their company works most effectively. But the more that, the richer those profiles are, the more that we're able to actually do a lot of the things that Noah described. So I think that there will be real value for our customers to be able to, introduce richer profile information, bring more of what, the directory, as you mentioned, bring more of that into Slack profiles. And then, our job will be to make sure that we can put that to really good use around relevancy, around helping you find experts, around helping you find the right person. So I think we've got some work to do there, and I think we also have some education to do with our customers about what's even already available today.
Yeah, I could see some AI, most responsive after 10 a.m. Put that right on my
I think
page.
The other thing is who you are isn't just the profile that you fill out. It's also, in the context of Slack, what you actually talk about, right? So I think being able to use kind of everything that you've communicated in all these public channels as a way of figuring out who is the person to talk to. If you're trying to write a story about Baidu, that may not be in a profile field of, companies I cover, but it probably is something that people talk about actively in all these different channels. How do we help find that Baidu report?
Yeah, right now it's a 6-step IM process. Like, hey, who should I ask about this? And then they send me to someone else.
Most knowledge work is a game of telephone.
Yeah.
Right? And part of our job at Slack is how do we kind of short circuit that game of telephone more effectively?
So you mentioned that most innovative companies now don't buy their IT from a monolithic company. But I can think of a monolithic company that's really fond of what you're building, so fond that they have just announced a competitor to it. And I'm curious what you think of the new Microsoft faux Slack.
That's a great question. So, Microsoft Teams, we saw that come out last week, 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, it feels like a long
What's
2
happened in the
weeks.
world? Yeah. So we're not surprised that that product came out. We had a sense that it was coming, and we ultimately really feel that is going to bring more attention to the category. And so, it's flattering in some ways. It's also, honestly, a little scary. They're a little bit larger than us as a company. They have some resources available to them and distribution advantages available to them that we don't have.
Even inspired a New York Times full-page ad. Were you involved in that one, or was that a?
It was a team effort.
All right.
And absolutely.
If you missed it, they bought a whole page in the New York Times and kind of tongue-in-cheek alluding to this old Steve Jobs thing, said, what is it, welcome Microsoft seriously or something like that?
We didn't include the seriously,
All
but
right.
but I mean, everything we said in it, we stand by, which is that it is honestly, it's daunting to know that we are not going to be alone in this category, and it's also validating to know that, that our hunch, that what we've built here and the sense that we've had from using it and seeing our customers use it and the benefits that they see from using it mean that this is not going to be a category of one. Like it just wouldn't make sense that if our customers continue to see the types of benefits that they tell us that they see, the reduction in email, the increase in productivity, the reduction in meetings, the love that people feel for Slack, the fact that they tweet marriage proposals to us. We know we're on to something here, and we have been. So we've been expecting that we would not be alone in this category forever, and that time has come. And we're ultimately excited about that. I mean, people need better ways to be able to get work done, and so we expect that we believe there's enough room in the market for more than one player. But what we're going to do is we're going to stay focused on our strategy, and so we are incredibly focused on how we can make sure Slack works great for teams of all sizes, including making it such that Slack can easily go wall to wall for the largest companies in the world. We're continuing to invest in our platform and bring developers from the largest companies in the world like Salesforce and IBM to startup developers that people haven't heard of yet, bring those apps to customers that can use them, and investing in what we're doing around, ultimately making Slack do the work for you and help your team work more effectively as it gets larger, as it uses the product more. So it doesn't change any of our strategy. It instead just validates that we're onto something that's important, and we're excited about the competition.
Awesome. And then now 3 years in, we're still doing a lot of internal communication with Slack, but not any real external communication. So I'm curious if that kind of fits into where you're going. Will I be able to Slack you instead of emailing you in the near future?
So the way that I think about Slack and where it's really best, it's for groups of people with a shared purpose. And so a lot of times, the people with whom you have the most shared purpose are those with whom who get a paycheck from the same company, so your colleagues. But I do think that there are going to be applications for Slack that extend to other groups of people with whom you may be working towards shared purpose. Where we don't want to go is down the path of opening Slack up to all the same ails that make email challenging. So spam, cold call emails, trying to pitch you software, for example. So the balance for us is going to be, how do we continue to make Slack this place that allows you to do focused work to be productive, but also extend it into some other use cases that we can address just inside your company today.
So spam is a great thing, and I'm glad you brought that up because, yes, inside Slack, I have no spam from the outside world, which is vastly different than email certainly was a long time ago. Now email filters are pretty good, but I still get a lot of, I call it spam. PR agencies don't, but anyway, they can't find me in Slack. But who can are lots and lots of coworkers asking me stuff that is a little mundane and maybe would not have made it into an email. So there's definitely an uptick of, in Slack, spammy, chatty type stuff. Is that good?
I guess what I would say is I think it's generally good with communication platforms to move towards reducing friction, right? Like what you're seeing is that people, because it's not having to address an email with a proper subject line and, Dan, I need your immediate attention on the coffee selection for the afternoon, you see people actually communicate more, and I think generally that's a good thing, especially when it's
Yo,
happening.
want coffee or something like
Well,
that.
especially when it's happening kind of publicly and transparently in channels. And one of the things that we see for a lot of teams, especially distributed teams, is like Slack gives them a sense of place that they were missing before when they're not in the same office. And I think net that's a good thing. The flip side of that obviously is how do you keep up with all of that? And that's really what we're trying to really focus on now is how do we take this kind of tidal wave of information and help you make sure that if you only have 5 minutes after this talk, what are the 5 conversations you should read, and what are the 20 that you can come back to later? So we're happy to see people be willing to communicate more frequently, lower that friction, make it more transparent, and it's on us now to make sure that the tool can help those people focus also when they have a limited amount of time.
Do you train companies on Slack etiquette? I noticed even your CEO apologized for using the @channel tag in. I believe he was telling the whole company to go vote on election day, and he's like, "Sorry for using @channel." It's like, wait, you're apologizing for using this feature that everyone has?
Well, we do have a proclivity towards apologies. It's sort of part of our culture at Slack. So preceding a notification to the entire company with a sorry is probably a good best practice, even when you need to do it. But I would say,
tip.
yes, exactly.
Yes.
So I think this is an area that we could do so much more. And so what happens is that we're oftentimes learning from our customers because we've been using this product since prior to it even being Slack, and so we have developed our own ways and best practices within Slack that are our little sort of tribal culture around how we use Slack. And so what happens is many of our customers develop those too. But I think that there's a lot of work that we could do to help people, kind of start with a higher baseline of those of what how you can sort of be courteous and empathetic to your colleagues. And you sound like you're very popular for coffee, and so maybe part of that is also helping people understand what the best way to use direct messages or channels or private groups, like what are the right forums in order to be able to allow their coworkers to be able to get real work done, because that's the actual goal here. So we're investing there more. We're also working with our customers to help kind of amplify some of the things that they've learned already within their organizations, and that's going to be a big focus for us next year.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, Slack, it's interesting. Most of the people who work at Slack had never worked in enterprise software before, right? Like April and I both came from Google and Twitter and from consumer backgrounds, and I think it's because Slack is an enterprise software by business model and by customer, but it's really a social piece of software. And I think when we're trying to figure out how to help customers use it the best, it's really thinking about them as an organization, not an individual. And we've actually started building out a whole research team of people who have PhDs in like organizational behavior and human-computer interaction design to better understand how customers use it as these groups and as these organizations, and figure out how to help them actually manage that change process of moving from an email paradigm to a Slack paradigm.
We're going to take questions in a minute, so if you would like to ask questions, please line up at one of the microphones, and we'll do that in a second. But I have one more question for you, which is a lot of times I like tracing out kind of the long game of companies, and if you make the optimistic case for Slack, it's that imagine if all of email, the whole protocol of email, was owned by one company. That's absolutely tremendous value that is unrealized today. But if you think of Slack as kind of the leader of this short-form, chat-like work communication, you do have the potential to own a huge percentage of that market. So how do you approach that, from an ethical perspective, or how do you make sure that you're doing the right thing for work, society, and the world when you build out your company?
Well, I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about organizations, but also thinking about the experience of being in the workplace and building features that help people do their best work. I mean, that's one of our values. So some of our values include, craftsmanship and empathy. And we bring that to what we do and how we work within Slack, and we mean those things very sincerely, and we try to extend those to the capabilities that we bring into the product. And so, for example, we launched the Do Not Disturb feature earlier this year, which allows you to basically put yourself into a mode where you don't get notifications. But it also signals that you are in that mode. It's clear when I, go to DM you that you're not going to receive the message. And so we put the thought into that because we want both people, on either side of that conversation or lack thereof to understand what the contract is, which is that you're not available right now. And that's one of the, we're going to keep looking for those opportunities to help make the experience of getting work done and doing work in Slack more rewarding and more productive, and really kind of increase the the productivity of the world through the audience of people using Slack. And so I think if we continue to focus on that, I think that allows us to be able to deliver upon our vision and do good in the world. And I think that we are, and that's based on the feedback that we get from our customers and how much people love using Slack. If they love using a work tool, then I feel like we're on the right track, and we just need to keep sticking with it.
Yeah. Benevolent leader. Thank you. Yeah. Great. Let's go to you.
Thank you very much. We are using Slack, and we made an integration for it too. So I have two questions. First is, what is the optimal size of teams to use it? Some days I log into Slack, almost every channel has something to look at. And there are too many group direct messaging, right? So I feel I go back to my email again. Yeah. And the second question is, when all these integrations happens, how do you promote apps or address discovery of applications? It will be probably a crowded app store again. And how do we find or promote our apps for target customers? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take the team one. You want to take the platform one? On the team size, I think right now what we'd say is like the optimal team size is probably the size of the set of people who are actually doing kind of a common work or purpose together. I think for most companies, it's probably on the order of hundreds, not thousands of people. When you see a company like an IBM or a Condé Nast or an eBay who have many thousands or tens of thousands of customers using Slack, they're usually breaking apart in a few different teams that kind of reflect the divisions of their company. In terms of kind of channels versus group DMs, this is a Slack best practice too. We kind of push people to say, if it's something that can be said publicly, it should be said publicly, because that can kind of avoid that fragmentation that you see in terms of, who actually saw this message, can anyone find it in the future? Like kind of pushing people to use those public channels, I think is definitely kind of a best practice instead of it getting trapped in more private conversations.
And then in terms of the Slack app directory, so as I mentioned, we have 750 apps, so a little over that in the Slack app directory as of today. The process that we use to introduce an app to the directory is that developers submit their apps for review, and we review them very closely. So by the time they're listed in the app directory, they will have useful descriptions that help you have an understanding of what they are. So from a developer standpoint, what can you do to drive discovery of your app? So right now, you put your best foot forward in helping customers understand why they should try out your application, just like you would merchandise your application anywhere else online. And then we have a handful of things we've been doing to pilot, basically bringing a spotlight or effectively merchandising and helping people discover some of the apps that we think are really notable, are new, are really stand out. And we're going to be investing in that more. And so one thing that's coming soon is that we're actually starting to experiment with ways for us to introduce some of our apps to our customers in more proactive ways. We're going to have to find the right balance with that, but we know many of our customers, they want to use more apps. They don't know how to go about finding them. They're not sure exactly how to sift through them. So just improving app discovery is something that is on the top of my priority list around platform, and that you're going to see more of going forward. So we're going to be meeting developers halfway and helping them get their apps in front of more customers, and that's going to be something that we just follow along until we find the right balance between customers and developers.
Great. Last question.
So you've developed a great platform for real-time or kind of real-time-ish collaboration, but compared to email, it seems pretty hard to send someone something that represents archival information, let alone to search or discover it. So I'm curious, what do you think of this as the models, the document representations for archived knowledge in the bowels of Slack?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think Slack can be used kind of, I would say, synchronously-ish, right? Like when there are a bunch of people who are all participating in a conversation at the same time, it does feel real time. But there's also a lot of asynchronous use cases that we have. Internally, we have channels for posting PR that happens about Slack where the discussion isn't real time. It's more, here's a running log of all these interesting articles. I think there's also a platform side to it as well, which is there are a lot of different tools that people use to take and put canonical knowledge, whether it's a CRM tool or it's a wiki tool that you have, or it's your finance or your HR tool, and being able to have pointers to all of those from Slack without actually having to store all that information within Slack. And then how do we actually take all those pointers and be able to maybe index and crawl them so that you can still search over it, but that information is stored in a canonical location that's not actually Slack itself. It's just Slack is a place where it's pushed, and Slack is a place where it is searched.
Right.
It's also a really interesting, sorry to interrupt, I don't even work at Slack, but it's also a really interesting cultural archive. If you join a company and then search your name, you can see what they were talking about you before you started, sometimes years before you started. It's very interesting. Anyway, sorry.
Sounds like a personal story there.
The last thing I was just going to say on that is that we truly are a platform, and we think about ourselves that way at a very deep level. And so at every company I've worked at, except for when I worked at Google that had its own document creation tools, it's usually the case that different teams are using different tools, and it's kind of this thing that makes you pull your hair out because one team's using a wiki and one team's using Google Sites and one team is using Quip and another team is using Docs. I mean, that is just that is very often the case. What we'd like to do is make Slack that equalizer that makes it such that teams can use whatever works best for them. That it actually makes each of those purchasing decisions and those tool selection choices. It reduces the risk of getting it wrong because it allows teams to use whatever works best for them, and then Slack unifies all of that together and then makes it all available via search. So. That's if we can accomplish that, then to some extent we sort of take the question, we take the fundamental issue away.
All right, very quick because we're way over now.
So my question is about email and team chat coming together. The reality is I spend so much time between these two different types of platforms, and it's a little schizophrenic going back and forth. So I just wonder, what's your thought on the idea of one single hub of email and chat?
Well, I think that for us, we think about it in terms of the group of people with whom you're communicating. So inside your company, the group of people with whom you have that shared purpose, we would like for Slack to be able to deliver upon that goal today. And we have customers for whom it is. That Slack is actually the place where all communication happens within the company, whether that's communication that would have happened via email or would have happened within chat. So you both got the real-time as well as longer form communication that can happen within Slack. Now, I think there are plenty of different types of roles, whether you're in sales or business development, where you may be working with a lot of people outside the company. And so, the bad news is I don't think email is going away for that purpose. It is a protocol that is used broadly, and because it is so ubiquitous, it does have value for that communication. In an ad hoc way with people that you don't necessarily work every single day. So we're not looking to solve that. That's not in our vision right now. But I do think that there are so many use cases for your day-to-day work for the people with whom you work most closely that Slack already solves. And we should chat afterwards, and I'll try to convince you that Slack is probably the answer to your woes.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks.